Intellectual empathy has very little to do with emotion or sentiment. In fact, it is simply about putting yourself in the mind of someone else and trying to imagine how a person might reasonably come to have the position that they have. The key word here is reasonably. Essentially, you're trying to construct a plausible case or a credible intellectual story that makes sense of the kinds of things that the person you're in conversation with or whose claims you're evaluating is saying. Part of that story might have something to do with motivation, for example, but mostly it's a question of trying to establish a reasons-based account of why the person might have arrived at their position. Now, this might at first seem like a strange thing to suggest if in fact you're already engaged in a conversation with someone. Couldn't you simply ask the person to explain why they believe what they believe and base how you respond on that? Certainly, that's part of what being a good interlocutor is about. But the point here is that even the kinds of questions that you ask someone are influenced by certain, sometimes unconscious, assumptions that you make about how the person reached the conclusions that they reached. Also, how you respond to what they might say is likewise colored by your assumptions about why, in general, the person thinks the way that they do. Let's look at an example to illustrate. Suppose that I am a political conservative and one day I get into a conversation with a socialist. The first question I ask this person is, why do you hate liberty? The socialist seems put out by this question and responds by saying that they do not actually hate liberty, that they simply believe that true liberty can only be achieved if, for example, major industry is brought under democratic control by workers. I respond by saying, I see. So you want politicians to run our lives. That's a complete joke. The socialist starts to become agitated and responds angrily that I have misrepresented what he believes. The conversation rapidly devolves into personal insults and resentment. You can create an equivalent story from the other side as well. A socialist meeting a conservative and asking the conservative, why do you hate poor people? And so on and so forth. The point here isn't to claim that conservatives or socialists habitually do this kind of thing. I've seen this on both sides, and I'm sure most of you have as well. The point is that the line of questioning in this example points to a set of background assumptions that I have about the socialist that manifest a lack of intellectual empathy. I, as the political conservative in the example, apparently think that one of the main motivations for socialists is simple hatred of liberty, and that they've constructed their political vision with a view to destroying it. I also seem to assume that they have a naive, blind faith in politicians. Now, without wanting to get into the weeds about what socialism is or is not, the point here is that I have clearly created a certain implausible motivational and rational backdrop for this person's belief in socialism. How reasonable is it really to think that a person would be genuinely motivated by or happy to accept a hatred of liberty or a blind faith in all politicians? Is that really a credible thing to think about someone? Is that a plausible intellectual path that would bring them to have their particular perspective? The obvious answer here is no. Almost no one would ever think that way. This isn't to say that there might not be some people out there who say have too much faith in politicians or who don't have enough respect or love for liberty, but almost nobody in the real world is going to literally hate liberty or trust all politicians blindly. And there's no credible intellectual story a person can tell about a socialist, say, such that those are among the main motivations and reasons for holding their position. Instead, I, as a political conservative, should think about motivations that I could imagine having that might lead me to believe in socialism. I should construct a background story that imputes psychologically realistic motivations and reasons to the person that I am engaging with, such that I could imagine how and why I could come to have such a point of view as well. What reasonable values might bring a person to socialism, for example? What kinds of commonplace experiences might move a person in that direction? Asking these kinds of provisional questions in your own mind, whatever the topic or area of debate, is good intellectual practice. Why? Because it makes it less likely that you will alienate, insult, or appear to belittle other participants in a discussion or debate. If you impute obviously ridiculous or extreme motivations and values to other people, they are going to not unreasonably conclude that you perceive them as intellectually naive or stupid or malevolent, or even as all three. However, if you manifest intellectual empathy, and this should come across in the kinds of questions that you ask, you're more likely to foster a productive, sustainable, and respectful discussion. Again, there may be rare cases where you will encounter someone with real extreme views, but if that is the case, soon enough, those people will make it apparent to you as you probe and question them anyway. But the probing and questioning should proceed on the basis of plausible, provisional assumptions about their motivations and reasoning. Intellectual empathy is perhaps the master virtue of being a good interlocutor, and from it one can derive all of the principles and best practices that you will find in our next 4 lessons. Striving to manifest intellectual empathy can be a challenge because, as we'll see, the temptation to strawman other people's views can be very powerful. It is about putting yourself in the cognitive shoes rather than the emotional shoes of another person, and it can require suspending many of our pre-existing assumptions about certain groups or certain belief systems. But the effort is almost certainly going to pay off in the form of improving the quality and durability of our discussions and debates.